Okay, great.
Then
It says
take
it's
over.
being live streamed.
Okay,
It
you
worked?
can take over. Yeah, you're good to go, Eduardo.
Okay. So can you make a, Sean, are you a co-host? Or if not, Lauren, I think we made Sean a co-host. You can share now your screen, and I apologize. You know how, guys, this is. We met yesterday, we tried it, and yeah, and that's all I can say. Let's go on to work.
Okay, when I hit share screen, oh, here we go. Here we go.
There we go.
All right.
Go. Yeah. Yep, you're ready. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
Well, thank you, everybody, for turning up this morning. And it's lovely to see new faces and some, I don't want to say old faces, but people I've known a long time. So lovely to see you all. And so I want to talk today about some new work that we've been doing. It's not that new, it's the last few years, but I have to admit that my research career has often involved seeing the animals do interesting things and trying to figure out what they're trying to tell me about what matters to them. And this talk and this work is very much inspired in that way. So I have been watching baboons for many years, and during most of those years, I resolutely ignored males. And I was focused mainly on what females were doing. But when I started this project on olive baboons, I must say the behavior of males struck me, and really they forced me to ask new questions, which have turned out to be really interesting. So let me begin by just sort of orienting us collectively to the general picture of what behavioral ecology tells us about the forces that shape male reproductive strategies. So when females tolerate others based on availability of resources and their ability to obtain the resources that their offspring need, when females aggregate, males have the ability to monopolize groups of females. And when one male can monopolize multiple females, it sets the stage for males to compete over those groups of females. Male-male competition favors sexual dimorphism in body size and weaponry. So we see males in many mammalian species being considerably larger than females. And this generates differences in the focus of reproductive efforts. So males generally derive higher payoffs from mating effort than parenting effort, while the opposite is generally true for females. So females invest heavily in rearing offspring, and usually more heavily in rearing offspring than in competing for mates. And that picture is usually reversed for males. Now we know that there are some species like these bat-eared foxes in which that pattern doesn't hold. So in some species, females are intolerant of other females, males form bonds with particular individual females, they establish pair bonds, and then males are more involved in, relatively less involved in mating effort and more involved in parenting effort. So we know that this variation in male reproductive strategies exists. And this is well documented in both detailed studies of individual species like Tim Kluttenbrock's work on red deer, and in comparative studies, which show that these patterns are generally robust within mammals. And so when we lecture on reproductive strategies in classes in behavioral ecology, this is what we tell students most of the time. And it looks like baboons missed this lecture. Male baboons seem to have not gotten this message about how mammalian males behave. So there are a number of species of baboons in Africa. And 4 of these species, olive baboons, Kinda baboons, Ursinus, Papio-Ursinus, or Chacma baboons, and Papio-cynocephalus, yellow baboons, form single-level societies. There's a number of other very nice baboons I'm not going to talk about today that live in multi-level societies, but these 4 single-level societies of these species of baboons all form single-level societies and have a number of features in common. They live in big multi-male, multi-female groups in which females are philopatric and males disperse when they reach sexual maturity. They have pronounced sexual dimorphism. Even in Kinda baboons, males are still almost twice as big as females. So they have pronounced sexual dimorphism in body size and weaponry. So males have very much larger canines than females do. Males compete over high-ranking positions within their groups, and they also sometimes compete directly over access to fully swollen females who are likely to conceive. And we know that there's considerable reproductive skew. So these data come from long-term studies of yellow baboons in Amboseli, and they show that high-ranking males obtain a much larger proportion of conceptions than lower-ranking males do. So up to now, male baboons look a lot like red deer. But we also know that in all of these species of baboons, males also form these strong ties to lactating females that have newborn infants. And we know that these relationships often actually emerge during pregnancy and then continue through lactation. So males are spending considerable amounts of time with lactating females, pregnant and lactating females. And males develop ties or relationships with infants and juveniles. These relationships haven't been studied as carefully as I think they should be now, but we do know that males spend some time engaged in some forms of, I don't know, male care is the right word, not active care, but they're with these kids. So they're babysitting, they occasionally groom them, they sometimes protect them when they're under threat from others. And they provide occasional escort services. So here's a male escorting an infant back around the opuntia where the mother is feeding. Sorry, this is my personal, highly professional video. So the male's taken the baby back to mom. Mom is obviously really concerned and walks off and leaves the baby with the male. So these are pretty common scenes in these baboon species. Sorry. Okay, so these relationships have been described in Chacmas, yellow, olive, and Kinda baboons. When the first really careful study of these male-female relationships was conducted by Barb Smuts in the 1980s. And she hypothesized that these relationships really functioned as a form of mating effort. And her idea was that by investing in these relationships with lactating females and being friendly to the females and protective of the females and tolerant of the infants, these males would basically earn mating rights and become preferred partners for females when they subsequently resume cycling. And so her book, Sex and Friendship in Baboons, describes these male-female relationships as what we would now, I think, label mating effort. But then in the late 90s and early 2000s, people watching particularly Chacma baboons began to think about these relationships in a different context. So it emerged that infanticide sometimes happened in multi-male groups, and it was observed in several populations of Chacma baboons, and actually more anecdotal observations of infanticide in olive baboons also became known at about this time. And based on work which was first done in Maremi, the circumstances of these of males' attention to infants and males' relationships with females suggested that these relationships might actually be designed to protect infants from infanticide. So these relationships became quite prominent after changes in male dominance hierarchies, where a new male assumed the alpha position. There were a number of infants whose deaths were attributed to infanticide in the Maremi population. And it suddenly occurred to people that maybe these relationships were actually designed not as a form of mating effort, but as a mechanism to protect infants that were vulnerable to infanticidal attacks. And so along the way, we also it became possible, I'm sorry, I'm touching my mouse, don't do that. It became possible to assess paternity using non-invasive methods. So in several populations of baboons, I guess all in 2010, 3 papers came out which documented the relationship between paternity and the identity of these male friends. And it turned out that sires are greatly overrepresented among friends based on their availability in the population. So although the numbers themselves in terms of how often friends were sires don't seem that high, sires are overrepresented within this group quite substantially. So we had data from 2 different Chacma populations and data from yellow baboons as well. Okay, so it turned out that this idea that these males were forming relationships with the mothers of their infants suggested that these relationships might actually represent a form of male parenting effort rather than male mating effort. And this was consistent with efforts to examine whether or not friends actually became the sires of female subsequent offspring. And at least 2 studies found little support for that idea. So friends were not likely to be future sires, but they were likely to be current sires of the current infant. So this really changed our view of the nature of these relationships. And that's basically where we were when I started a study of baboons in the Laikipia region of Kenya. I came to ASU, I had a pile of startup money, and I thought the best way for me to spend that money was to start a study of a new population of baboons that I hadn't ever studied before. So I worked with Shirley Strum, who had been running a long-term study of olive baboons in Laikipia, Kenya for many years, I think almost 40 years by the time we began working with Shirley. And these baboons had been translocated from one location in Kenya to another about 20 years before we started working there, and they had adjusted to life in this new area. And so we started a regular bog standard study of baboon social behavior. So we collected lots of focal observations, was well trained by Jean Altman, always collect focal observations. So we collected a large body of focal observations over a period of about 4 or 5 years. But now we also added this element, which we hadn't had in any previous studies that I'd been involved in, which is the ability to identify sires of infants. Okay, so my research assistants cheerfully gathered fecal samples so we could identify the sires of infants. And I was struck while watching baboons about how conspicuous these relationships between males and females were. So it was just obvious that we ought to follow up on previous work to find out who the sires of females infants were, and that would enable us both to look at the extent of male reproductive skew within this population and to think more about the functional significance of these relationships between males and females. And now I'm going to stop talking about friends and start talking about what I call primary associates, because I think we've now reached a point where it makes sense to separate our concepts about what these relationships, how these relationships work. The term friends focuses on the nature of the affiliative relationship between the male and the female. And I think the work that we've done more recently and the paternity analysis suggests that these relationships are not about the affiliative bond between the male and the female, but about the joint interest that males and females have in the welfare of infants. And Nia Wynn used a phrase, which I like, called joint parental care. And that's what I think these relationships are. So I like this more neutral term of primary associates to refer to females and their male partners, the males with whom they spend the most time when they're pregnant and have newborn infants. Okay, so in our population, we're able to examine the patterns of association between males and females and compare patterns for sires of a female's current infant, sires of her next infant, and all other males. And here we're using my now infamous dyadic sociality index, which we can talk about later, but basically it's an index that combines information about different forms of social interactions to create a cumulative index or a composite index. That's the word I want, a composite index where high values indicate pairs that spend a lot of time together, have high levels of affiliative interactions, and low numbers represent pairs that spend very little time together, have very low levels of affiliative interactions. And so what you see is that during pregnancy and during lactation, the distribution of dyadic sociality index values for sires are shifted to the right. So sires of the current infant have stronger ties to females than sires of the next infant or other males. And you can see that sires of the next infant and other males are really very similar. So this is further support for the idea that these relationships reflect current paternity and they don't predict subsequent paternities. So this is entirely consistent with the work that was done by Nia Nguyen on yellow baboons, and that was done by Elise Huchard on Chacma baboons in Namibia, and work from Maremi on Chacma baboons there. So far, this confirms what we already knew, which is nice. And in our population, we found that the primary associates were overrepresented among sires, and our numbers are very similar to the numbers from Ambaselli. So about 37% of the primary associates were the sires of the female's current infant. So this work supports the idea that these relationships represent a form of joint parental care. And so they're parenting effort rather than mating effort. Okay. So now in at least 3 species, we have this rather consistent picture of the nature of primary associations. So olive, yellow, and chocolate baboons form these relationships, and they seem to represent a form of parental investment in the welfare of infants, protecting perhaps against feticide during pregnancy, perhaps against infanticide after birth, and perhaps contributing in other ways to the welfare of infants. And I should say, we don't know this about kindas yet because we haven't done the work. So for populations, primary associates are often sires, okay? But I looked at these numbers, and on the one hand, it's very consistent with it. You know, we can tell a consistent evolutionary story about the function of these relationships. But when you're actually looking at the numbers, especially if you look beyond the Chacma baboons in Namibia, in which 88% of the primary associates are the sires, you see that these numbers are really not that high. So if there's an adaptation for joint parental care, it's an adaptation that seems to be a bit messy. And that's either totally what you'd expect because, you know, it's hard to know who your kids are. That you can think of various reasons why it's okay for these numbers to be so low, but I thought it was really kind of intriguing to think about that, because the magnitude of these numbers indicates that males are making 2 different kinds of errors. Maybe not errors, but there are 2 kinds of mismatches that must be going on to get these numbers. And that there's one mismatch, which is that some of the primary associates are evidently not the sires of the female's infants. So males are forming primary associations with females, but they're not the fathers of their offspring. And the other side of the mismatch is that there must be also a bunch of sires who aren't becoming primary associates. Okay, we have a statistical relationship between paternity and the identity of primary associates, but they're not doing that great a job. And so here I am working away at my computer, and I have nothing better to do but to ponder this. So we started thinking about it. And I want to talk now about both of these mismatches. Okay, so some primary associates are not sires. And, you know, maybe that's not a big surprise. I mean, how do males know that they're the sires of particular infants? We have assumed for decades that males don't know, right? So if we didn't think they knew, we oughtn't be surprised that they're often confused. And they don't have DNA fingerprinting results to rely on to identify their kids. So how do they do it in real life? Well, they might use phenotypic cues from the infant, but these relationships are emerging during pregnancy when they don't have those cues to go by. So we think that they're relying on their experiences when females were cycling. So this is the dyadic sociality index between males and fully swollen females who are likely to conceive, and the probability of siring the infant. And what you can see is that the more time males are spending and interacting with females when they're fully swollen, the more likely they are to sire the infant. So, and this is consistent with work from Ambicelli, presented in a slightly different way, is that males' mate guarding behavior basically is a pretty good predictor of paternity. Not perfect, you can see that here and you can see that in other analyses, but it's pretty good. So we think that males are somehow using, or perhaps females are using information about their behavior when the female was likely to conceive to obtain information about their likelihood of siring the infant. And here in an analysis that that we did, we looked at another measure, which is highly correlated with the DSI, which is the frequency of male approaches to fully swollen females. And now we have these 4 categories of males that we're comparing. So a male could be the sire and also become the primary associate. So these are guys who are apparently making correct inferences about paternity. And in particular, we're interested here in these pink ones, which are males that are not the sire and do become the primary associate. Okay, so there are some males who are becoming primary associates who are not sires. Why? And there are also males who have sired the infant and do become primary associates. And when you look at these data, if confusion about paternity was driving males to become primary associates, even when they weren't the sire, we'd expect this pink hill, which is the distribution of this behavioral measure for males who weren't the sire and became the primary associate, to be this hill to be closer and less easily distinguishable from this distribution, which is for sires who do become primary associates. So if they have confusion based on behavioral cues about what happened during paternity, we'd expect those hills, those distributions to overlap more than they do. I mean, this isn't a definitive test, but it does mean that these 2 categories of males behave differently toward females when the females are likely to conceive. So we can't rule out confusion because who knows what's going on in those guys' tiny little brains. But at least the behavioral cues are pretty different. Okay, so that's only it speaks to this question about confusion, but it doesn't resolve it completely. But Veronica Steadley, who is the first author of this analysis and who did all of our paternity analyses for the baboons, had another idea. So if you read about these male-female relationships, and if you look at some of the early dissertations that were done on baboons in the 80s that haven't all been published, but are really very interesting. It turns out that a number of people have pointed out that males maintain relationships with these kids even after the kids are weaned. And so males use these primary associations to establish these long-standing ties to kids, ties which might endure beyond weaning. And so Vroni had the idea that maybe these males who weren't sires of the female's current infant were actually sires of the previous infant. So if males are spending time with kids who are now weaned, juveniles, so males are still spending time with these weaned juveniles, and the juveniles are spending a lot of time with their mothers, then perhaps some of these primary associates who weren't the sires of the current infant were actually sires of the previous infant. And that's what these data represent. So Vroni went back to the data and identified cases in which a primary associate was the sire of the female's current infant and also her previous infant. Cases where a male was a sire of the previous infant, but not the current infant. Cases where the male was a sire of the current infant, but not the previous infant. And cases where the male was a sire of neither kid. And you can see here pretty clearly that primary associates who are not, there's a strong tendency for males who are the sires of the previous infant to also become primary associates. And that tendency is almost as strong as a tendency for sires of the current infant to become primary associates. And, and when males are the sires of both kids, they're very likely to be primary associates. So we think that in at least some cases, and maybe in a lot of cases, males who are not the sire of the female's current infant are in fact leftovers from these are leftover relationships from the previous infant. So we don't know if this holds in other populations, but at least within our population, this explains some of that type of mismatch, that a male is a primary associate, but not the sire of the current infant. In fact, that male may be the sire of a previous infant. So that at least is a partial answer to why some males become primary associates, even when they're not the sire of the current infant. And this yellow violin is very low. So if there's not paternity of either of these current or last infant, the chance of becoming a primary associate is really very low. Okay, so we're halfway through. So now we have cases where sires don't become primary associates, and that's also a puzzle. If these relationships are important for kids, and if keeping kids alive is an important component of males' reproductive success and lifetime fitness, then why aren't males becoming primary associates? And one obvious possibility is that the males aren't there. Male baboons disperse when they reach sexual maturity, but they also may transfer again multiple times over the course of their lives. So why there are many reasons why males might not become primary associates. Males could have died. Males may have left the group. They may have disappeared and we don't know if they died or dispersed, or they're just not up for the job, which I call, so they could be dead, dispersed, disappeared, or simply deadbeats. So again, we can't interview them about their motivations and rationale, but we can look at the data. So first, we were interested to know, are males present during their infants' early days? And here I've indicated the time of weaning. And what you see is almost all the dads are still in the group up to the time their infants are weaned, and some are in the group considerably longer. So they're there. Not every male, but a lot of those guys are still there in the group. So there are males who are present, but not becoming primary associates. And it occurred to me that maybe this variation in whether or not sires become primary associates might reflect changes in males' reproductive tactics as they age. And this has to do with the life history of male baboons, which is quite well established. So male dominance rank depends largely on males' physical condition, and males are most likely to reach high rank and hold high-ranking positions within their groups when they're in early adulthood. And these are data from our Lacipia baboons, but Susan Alberts has documented very similar patterns in the Amboseli baboons. And so there is a period in males' lives when they are most likely to hold high-ranking positions. And then as they age out or they get older, their ranks begin to fall. So there is this very restricted period in a male's life when he's likely to be able to hold a high-ranking position. And there is a strong relationship, not perfect, but a strong relationship between male rank and reproductive success, which means there's also this hump in the probability of siring offspring as a function of male age. So as you can see, males are most likely to sire offspring in early adulthood, sort of between 8 and 11. And after that, it just drops off. I kind of think of my career that way. You know, I'm sort of in this sort of slowly declining phase, you know, and I'm trying to be cheerful about it, you know, trying to find other interests, trying to be gracious about it. So perhaps I'm identifying too directly with these male baboons, but it occurred to me that there would be perhaps a rationale for males to focus on different aspects of reproductive effort over the course of their lives. So early on, it might all be about mating effort, doing everything you can to increase the probability that you will reach high rank. But then after a certain point, maybe when you're 10, maybe when you're 11, there's really not much payoff from investing in mating effort. And it might make sense at that point in your life to shift toward greater investment in parenting effort. because investment in mating effort it seems unlikely to have much payoff. But maybe investment in parenting effort might keep infants alive longer and have a greater adaptive payoff. So if that thinking is right, then we ought to see a change in males' likelihood of becoming primary associates as they get older. All right, so this data then represents the likelihood of becoming a primary associate as a function of male age. And you can see that holding paternity constant. You can see that males are more likely to become involved in primary associations as they get older. So a lot of these primary associates then tend to be older males who don't have very high prospects for siring infants. So we think that the reason that not all males who are sires become primary associates is that younger males obtain higher payoffs from investing in mating effort than investing in parenting effort. But that changes as they age. All right, so that explanation hinges on the assumption that males have to make trade-offs between mating effort and parenting effort. And you know, that seems plausible. And that assumption is pretty strongly embedded in the behavioral ecology literature. And we sort of assume that there are trade-offs, and in some cases we can investigate them. There's not a lot of direct evidence within species for trade-offs between mating effort and parenting effort based on behavioral data or behavior, you know, how males organize their behavior. But it does seem likely that might be the case. And so I think about this guy, and I'm imagining that he's watching a fully swollen female walk by. And he's got to make an assessment about whether or not he should follow that fully swollen female, or he should stay with his primary associate and her kids. So it occurred to me that we could use our data to investigate whether or not males seem to make trade-offs between mating effort and parenting effort. And so this became the topic of a MA thesis done by one of graduate students, Caitlin Hawley, where we've been trying to investigate this question. And I have to say that although I think this is a really great question, I think we have a really nice data set, I have never had so much trouble getting a paper published. So this is in limbo, as my friend Richard Connor likes to say. So this is a paper and analysis that is in limbo. Okay. So what we did was we investigated a measure of male mating effort, which were approaches to within 1 meter of a fully swollen female. We also, for each male on each day, tabulated how many primary associations he was involved in. Okay, so this male, for example, might be involved in 2 primary associations with these 2 females and their kids. Okay, so on any given day, a male might or might not approach a fully swollen female, and that male might be involved in some number of primary associations. And we're interested in finding out whether or not the number of primary associations a male is involved in influences or is related to the amount of effort he makes to gain access to fully swollen females. That's what we are trying to do. Okay, so as it turns out, the number of primary associations males were involved with on a given day ranged from 0 to 5. Not very many males have 5 primary associations on the go at any given time, but lots of males have 1, some males have 2. Okay, some males have none. And then we constructed a model in which we basically asked whether or not the number of primary associations a male was involved in was related to the number or the rate of approaches to fully swollen females on a given day. And so what you can see is that males who are involved in that label, a reviewer pointed out to us, was very confusing. What we really mean here is more than 2 primary associations is approaching fully swollen females less often than males who are involved in 2 primary associations, 1 primary association, or no primary associations. So there is a robust negative relationship between the number of primary associations a male is involved in at a given time and the rate of approaches to fully swollen females. And this controls for male rank. And it controls for the number of females in the group, number of fully swollen females in the group, and a few other things that we thought might be important. So this suggests to us that males are balancing mating effort and parenting effort to some extent, and that this supports the interpretation of the age-related changes in male reproductive tactics as they age. Okay, so we think that males adjust their reproductive tactics to in ways that are consistent with increasing their lifetime fitness. Early in their lives, males compete for high-ranking positions, but later in their lives, when they have few prospects for siring offspring, they switch to a strategy in which they pay more attention to their offspring and engage in behaviors that may increase the chances that those kids will survive and live to reproductive age. Although I have to say, we can't connect these relationships with that outcome for kids yet. Okay, so I think that we have evidence now about the way these relationships function in these species of baboons, although kindas remain a bit of a mystery. But hopefully there's ongoing work on kindas. We're learning more and more. And I want to be reincarnated to come back and be able to study kinda baboons. But we now have, I think, a more complex and complete picture of what males are doing. However, whenever I write papers and whenever I try to make connections between the work that people that working on primate behavioral ecology are doing and the work of some of my other colleagues in evolutionary anthropology or in behavioral ecology, I always get the criticism, Tim, you'll appreciate this, that all my references are baboons. So all my citations are about baboons. And so the question is, what do these findings mean in some larger context? Which I do think about sometimes, and I think is important. Baboons are great all by themselves, and even if we didn't learn anything that was relevant to any other animals, that would be fine. But when we do, and we should think about how our results apply more broadly. And this work on baboons, while I was doing that and thinking about that, I would send copies of graphs and results to my friend Stacy Rosenbaum, who is one of my former graduate students. I'm a very proud advisor. I don't want to claim credit, but for anything Stacy has accomplished. But Stacy it's always been interesting that I study baboons. Stacy studied gorillas. They're so different in so many ways. So basically, I provided no useful feedback to Stacy all those years, I don't think, but it occurred to us during the pandemic that we ought to really think through some of the conversations we've been having over the last many years about this common evolution of male care in primates. So she was documenting all these amazing things in baboons while I was struggling to figure out all these amazing things that were happening with the male gorillas while I was struggling to figure out what male baboons were doing. And it occurred to us that what we were both describing is something that really was a kind of different way of thinking about the evolution of male parental care. So we worked on this paper, which was published in Evolutionary Anthropology, in which we tried to document what we call pathways to paternal care in primates. Okay, so we all have this general idea about when male care will evolve. When there's stable breeding bonds, when males have few and females have few alternative partners, there'll be high paternity certainty. There won't be a lot of payoff for searching for investing in reproductive effort. So we'll see evolution favoring male parental care. And of course, owl monkeys are the poster child for this, this pattern. And we know that this is a robust pattern in nature based on lots of nice comparative work done by Dieter Lucas and Tim Klettenbrock. So that's there. That's a very important set of evolutionary forces favoring the evolution of male parental care. But one of the interesting implications of that model for thinking about the evolution of male care in general, and for thinking about the evolution of male care in our hominin ancestors, is that it assumes that there's one pathway to the evolution of male care, and it goes through pair bonds and limits on the number of alternative partners, and that's the pathway. Okay, and I've always I have a degree in anthropology. I've always worked in anthropology departments, and part of the things people like me are interested in is how the work we do on other animals helps inform our thoughts and models about the evolution of our own species history. So for a long time, there's been a picture that before we can think about the adaptive importance of male parental care in the hominin lineage, we have to begin with a pair-bonded species. And our closest relatives, and probably the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, was not a pair-bonded animal. Okay, so we have to get, basically you have to take a chimp-like animal, create a pair-bonded animal before you can get any substantial selection favoring male parental care. And so we think the work on gorillas and baboons suggests that that picture is incomplete and perhaps too limited. So Stacy's documented the pattern and of male-infant relationships in mountain gorillas, and she has found that males form these long-term relationships with particular kids within their groups. These are a third of the, a lot of the mountain gorilla groups are multi-male. And what she's also found is that these relationships with males and kids are not particularly selective regarding paternity. So males don't distinguish between their own infants and other males' infants in forming these relationships. And she's also found out, most amazingly, that males who are most active in maintaining relationships, these kinds of relationships with kids, have higher fitness. So male care in gorillas, Stacy thinks, is likely to be actually a form of male mating effort as much as it is a form of male parenting effort, because females may prefer males who form these kinds of strong protective relationships with their kids. And baboons, who do things a little differently. So in baboons, we have a species that lives in multi-male, multi-female groups with high male reproductive skew, but we also have the formation of close ties between males, the mothers of their offspring, and we think extended ties to infant and juvenile offspring. Okay, so we have gorillas, we have baboons, and we personally are very intrigued by observations that my colleague Kevin Lankergraber has made with the Ngogo chimpanzees, which suggests that males have extended mating relationships with females. So the same male sires successive infants of particular females. And these long-term, relatively long-term mating bonds seem to persist in a multi-male group, but no evidence of male parental care. So I guess what we think from what we convinced ourselves in writing this paper was that there were multiple pathways to the evolution of parental care or male offspring care in primates, and the conventional model is incomplete. And of course, what's really interesting then is to figure out what it is that has favored the evolution of these alternative strategies in these other taxa. Why is it that baboons go in for these parenting investment? Why do males invest in parenting effort when males that live in other kinds of multi-male, multi-female groups might not? So the intriguing questions now are to kind of get at what selective forces have favored the evolution of these kinds of relationships and male parenting investment in general. Okay, I need to acknowledge all my helpers in the field because this project was really kind of bottom up, that we watched the animals, we tried to figure out what they wanted to tell us about what they were doing, and tried to design analyses that would allow us to answer some of these questions. So Shirley Strom and Ayla Roberts, who was the manager of my field project, James Kingua, who helped us with our daily observations, and David Maruri, who managed the project from Nairobi. A whole bunch of people who came out and collected behavioral data and collected fecal samples for us. And the people that worked hard in the lab to do the paternity analysis that was done in Lynn Vigilant's lab at Leipzig and done by my heroic postdoc, Veronica Steadley, and all the people who made this work possible. So thanks very much. I'd be happy to talk about baboons at length, forever.
Thank you very much, Joan, for a wonderful talk. I'm sure there will be lots of questions, and we'll have a wonderful discussion, as it is always the case for our fine seminar series. For those of you who may be new, or if you just don't remember, what we do now is we move on to a period that's going to go through 2 p.m. Argentina time. I guess it is noon in the U.S. Eastern. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask, I invite you to just simply type a question mark in the chatting window. I'm going to follow those, and I will call you, and we ask that if you can please give your name. Sometimes it doesn't show fully in the Zoom window, and also your affiliation. And we'll just go in order. We take the liberty of sometimes giving priority to students or people who have not asked questions before, so that we keep broadening the FINE community. So with that, I'm already seeing some question marks popping up. And our first question comes from Karsten. Karsten, please.
Yes, hello, I'm Carsten Schradin from the CNRS in Strasbourg, France, doing fieldwork in South Africa on small mammals and mammalian social evolution. Thank you for a great talk, Joan, and it's really amazing, all these data over all these years. It's so difficult to get data from small mammals. I can imagine getting all these data from so many life histories of baboons. It's just amazing. I have just one quick comment before I come to my actual question, which you might have answered in the talk, and I might have overlooked it. But of course, the fact that pair bonding and paternal care doesn't have to go hand in hand is also well known from other mammals outside of primates. Like from aardwolves, it's known the male and females don't really like each other, but the male paternal care is very important for his fitness. And in striped mice, there are social bonds between the male and females, but not pair bonds. And it's also paternal care highly developed. So this is even broader than the primates, that this fact is now known. So my question goes, but maybe you said it, I didn't fully understand it. When these males are primarily associated with infants and protect the infants and all these things, are more likely to be the sire. And the second question, one of your second question was, why do not all sires are primary associates? And maybe I misunderstood, because some later slides, can males be primary sires of several infants, or can there also be cases that one male is very successful, he has 3 infants, and thus he can only be the primary associate of one infant because he doesn't have enough time for all of his offspring in the group?
So males, so what happens what you see in the field is you'll see a male, and he'll be sitting with sometimes 1 female, sometimes 2 females, sometimes 3 females. And it turns out that males can have primary associations with multiple females at the same time. I mean, now that I know what I know, I would really like to know more about these relationships, because they're not seasonal breeders. So and let's imagine just now that he is actually maintaining relationships with 3 of his kids rather than the females. Those kids can be different ages, right? And so, one female has a newborn, one female is still pregnant, one female has a 1-year-old. So yeah, he can. I mean, one of the things we don't know is it's a little hard to work out the economics of these relationships. They don't seem to be that time-consuming or that demanding. And but data that I didn't tell you about is that the more primary associations a male has, the less responsibility he takes for maintaining proximity to the female, which suggests that, so many females, so little time, that there may be constraints, but it's a little hard to figure out what those are.
Okay, thank you.
Next question is from Kaya Tombak. Kaya?
Hi, I'm Kaya Tombak, postdoc at Hunter College. Thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if you ever see females kind of more actively trying to boss males around and manage their time for them. Is there some interference that you see? And for example, if they're associating with other females, do they ever sort of dump an infant on their lap? Is there that kind of dynamic?
So we were interested in another set of analyses. We were a bit interested in, for want of a better term, we call the co-wife analysis. So there's a male, he has 3 primary associates. Those females are his little group, right? So we see no evidence that females are competing over access to these males. They're not more aggressive. We see very little conflict. It doesn't look like the male is a resource that females have to compete over. Although, as I said, when males have more primary associates, the more primary associations a male has, the larger role the females play in maintaining proximity to him. So in terms of coordinating these relationships, females might have to do a little bit more work. They're already doing most of the grooming, but we just don't see much evidence that females are fighting over these guys. And we're not quite sure why, or, you know, we don't, I mean, the dynamics of these relationships and what males are really doing with their time is still somewhat unclear. I really think this is a great dissertation topic to kind of focus on these relationships from the male's point of view and to try to tease out some of these things.
Thank you, Kaya. I am next. And I apologize, but sometimes I need to get these doubts out of my mind in case I completely got it wrong. Karsten was making reference to primary associations with infants, but if did I get it wrong? But everything you presented about primary associates, it's with females, not with infants. In fact, that takes me to the next question. If we're interested in infant care, why do a proxy, which is the female, which you showed us a video that raises the issue that well, but there goes a mom away. If we were to look at the actual data collected on that instance, we'll probably have no data in favor of the male providing care because now the female is walking away. So the data would say female walked away from male, but in terms of care, you were describing. So I'm getting a little bit confused. The data are on the female as a proxy for care. There are no data on care.
Yes, you are right. So there are two answers to this. One is, if I knew what I knew now, I would design the study differently. If I wanted to understand the dynamics of those relationships, I would focus on the males and their relationship with the kids and the females, right? So we have limited data on males. We have some data, focal data on males, but not great data on their interactions with kids for reasons that, basically you have better data on some things than others and more confidence in some things than others. And I don't have as much confidence in our male kid data as I do in our female data, because my observers maybe weren't as good about IDing the kids. So I don't have the perfect data set to assess some of these questions. And you're right that we are looking at that mainly through the lens of the female. And that means it's not possible to address some of the questions that we'd like to address about male care. So you're right. There are gaps in the data. So we have limited information about what males are actually doing with kids. We understand the relationship between the male and the female fairly well. We know whether or not the infant is present or not present, but we don't have a really good handle on male immature interactions.
Okay, that clarifies a lot to me, but I wonder if this is in fact an amazing opportunity, because if some of those data were never collected with preconceived ideas of what to expect from the male and the infant, is it possible that you may be looking at these data that the assistants were not paying attention to? Suddenly, for unplanned reasons, one may have removed potential sources of bias in collecting the data on male-infant relationships because, to put it bluntly, nobody was paying attention to them. Nobody was caring about them.
I don't think we're in a position to say very much at all about male-infant relationships. We can only build on what people from other sites have seen. So, for example, Nancy Nicholson studied mother-infant interactions in Gilgil in the early, I don't know, a long time ago. Was their dissertation work. Really not much of it was published. So that would have been in the 70s. And then another graduate student, Julie Johnson, followed up. And so you can connect up what I would call primary associations of females and males with the behavior of juveniles. So Nancy's infants became Julie's juveniles, and you can connect up those relationships. So I'm speculating about the nature of relationships between males, infants, and males and juveniles. But we do have some clues based on work from other sites. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
It is an opportunity. I think there's a
Yeah.
bunch of really good questions for somebody to follow up on.
Thank you. To David Wood, you're next. And if somebody could help me keep an eye on our fine community watching us live on YouTube, I would very much appreciate that, and let me know if we have questions from them. Thank you. David?
Hi, thanks for a super interesting talk. I'm David Wood. I'm a PhD student at Yale working with Eduardo. I'm actually currently at the Primate Center in Davis, looking at the infant care in the TT monkeys here. And I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit more the persistence of these associations between, I guess I'm more interested in the relationships between the males and the infants as they become juveniles, and whether they all, once they're grown, I guess, leave the group, or how long these associations persist.
Hold on just a second. Real life is intruding here. No, I can't. I can't tell you anything. I'd love to tell you. So I'm a little bit heartbroken because we had a PhD project planned to pursue some of these questions, and it didn't happen for various reasons. So I'm a bit heartbroken about that, but I can't. So this is really frustrating to me. So we do all this analysis. We now have these burning questions which are open. So I can't really tell you much about that. I mean, we know from Amboseli that, and this is one of the things that got us thinking about this. So we have data from Amboseli that their sires are supporting their own offspring in conflicts more than they're supporting non-offspring. So we have that result. There's also data from Amboseli which shows that I think we've all been surprised by the persistence of sires in groups, in Amboseli, I don't know, half the kids had sires, their sires were still in the group when they were, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old. And I don't think we really had that picture in our heads. So, and the presence of sires has some impact, downstream impact on reproductive histories or timing of maturation for offspring. But we just don't know any of these things.
Thanks.
Thanks, Logan, for keeping an eye on YouTube. Let me know. Do we have Clara? You're next.
Thanks for the talk. Very interesting, lots of questions. Since there wasn't another question, I decided to try to place this within the broad context of mammal social evolution, indeed vertebrates. And I was curious, given the very interesting different roles that you show at the beginning of the talk, that males play with, that males demonstrate with infants. And if you consider that males may be guarding females when they're with them, I wonder if you're willing to consider this as helping behavior on the part of the males.
I don't know. I mean, we have this picture that, I mean, that's been sort of handed down, that males play a role in protecting these females, and males. I think, you know, in terms of kind of, I mean, I don't know. What do females gain from these relationships? Do females gain anything directly from these relationships other than the benefits that their kids might get? I don't know. Do these males, it makes sense that these males would be protective of females, because if the female, something happens to mom, then something's going to happen to the kid. And there is evidence from some studies that males, their presence deters rough infant handling. Their presence, they support their female associates. Barb has that in her book. I guess it depends on, there are two questions. One is, do males provide any kind of material benefits to females themselves? And the second is, would we think of that as help? And, you know, the second is I'm not sure, you know, what evidence we'd need. The question is, but the larger question, or the more direct question, is, do males provide material benefits to females? I think the answer is, we don't really know. And I mean, they're spending a lot of time with the females, spending a certain amount of time with the females. Females are investing in these relationships. Females are grooming these guys more. I think females are more comfortable around these males than they are with other males. So the balance between, so females don't often approach males, and males approach females. Females don't approach males. Males are big and scary. But females seem to be much more comfortable around their primary associates. So the balance of who approaches who is much more balanced for primary associates than for female males.
Not to belabor this, but one thing that I would stress more, which I think is really, really important, is that these associations occur primarily when females are gestating or lactating, which would be the most energetically costly period in their careers, in their reproductive careers. So I think that could be, you know, really highlighted as a generator of hypotheses.
I agree. I've done some work on these male-female relationships, and one of the complications is that there are different ways for identifying these relationships, and if you have a categorical system for identifying the relationships, then that sort of treats all primary associations as being equivalent. But if you deal with it as a quantitative phenomena, some females have stronger ties to males than others, and you might expect that females that have stronger ties to males, or spending more time with males, or grooming males more, or basically, and that's what I mean by stronger ties, might have a different life than females who have weaker ties to males. And I've tried to investigate that a bit, and I haven't gotten real far. But that's been sort of, I mean, that's kind of one of the underlying questions I started with, and I kind of got a bit sidetracked with these more specific projects. But that's gestating in the back of my mind of how to kind of get a sense of what these relationships might do for both parties. There was, and it's, as it's always true, at this stage of things, the data are sitting there, and the question is, what questions can I answer with the data I have, and generate meaningful analyses? And we've done a bunch of stuff, but I'm not entirely done.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
For those of you who maybe are joining us for the first time, please don't hesitate. We welcome all questions from students, from everyone. So this is a fantastic, relaxed opportunity. That's the kind of setting we want to create for just ask your question. All questions are welcome. We always learn from hearing from all of you. And I noticed that's great. So I'm going to call on Amiyal Ilani, and then we have Vibhuti Bhatt. Amiyal, please, if you can let us know. I'm not seeing you.
Thank you. Hi, Joan.
Oh, there you are. Yes.
Thank you for the fascinating talk, and I have to apologize because I missed the last part of it due to some parenting efforts. So I will take the risk and ask some questions that may have been asked before I rejoined, and if it's been answered, then just let me know and I'll watch the YouTube later. My first one is, are there some males that do not spend time with infants?
I think the answer is almost certainly yes, that there are males who never form primary associations. There probably are some who never in their life get involved in these relationships. The problem is, I have a sort of small window of time, so I can't really say that. There are males that during our project 4 or 5 years who never turn up as primary associates. So my assumption is there's variation in everything, but really trying to get at variation in males' involvement in primary associations. All we know is that they're more likely to be involved as they get older. They're more likely to be involved if they're the sire of the present infant or the previous infant. And that's kind of what we know.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you can learn something from looking at males that you have not observed in this doing this behavior. Then maybe it's correlated with like not being seen with females during copulation time and so on.
Well, we do know that these guys who are forming primary associations were also, male's behavior toward the female when she was fully swollen is associated with their turning up as primary associates for sure. But that doesn't really tell us very much about those guys who are not doing it, except that you could be high ranking and young and have been behaviorally, been mate guarding a female when she's fully swollen and still not become a primary associate. If you're in that age range where males are not very likely to form primary associations.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Another question, if I may. So regarding the fact that some primary associates are not the fathers, I was wondering if maybe males who mated with multiple females just sort of bet on the most likely offspring, and that may cause them to miss in some cases?
That's a great question, and because you think about this guy and how he's, what information is available to males and what trade-offs do they make? I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question. I do think that because baboons tend to mate guard females, there is at least in some situations, if females are simultaneously receptive, that males would partition their efforts and stay with, mate guard one female rather than running back and forth between two females. Now, alpha males might be able to exploit the situation a little differently, but most males would probably partition their efforts. And that's part of why reproductive skew is not higher than it is, because of this phenomena that when multiple females are simultaneously receptive, males, a single male can't monopolize multiple females. Usually, it's not always true, but usually true. So yes, to some extent, but males are, that might add confusion. I mated with 2 or 3 females on the same day, and I don't really know whether I'm the sire of any of their infants. I mean, all we can do is just look at the behavioral signal and say that we can't rule out the idea that males are confused about paternity, but we can just say that there's a behavioral signal associated with paternity that differentiates these categories of males, but that's all we can say.
Amiel, could you please let us know where you are so we get to know each other a bit more? If you can introduce yourself.
Sorry, yes, I'm at Bar Ilan University in Israel.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Vibhuti Bhatt. And again, Vibhuti, if you can please introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from. You're muted.
Hi, am I audible?
You're good, yeah.
Okay. So thanks for the wonderful talk. My name is Vibhuti, and I've recently started my PhD at University of Würzburg, Germany. My project is about research on social ants, their rescue and wound care behavior. So my question is a bit basic in the context of what you presented today. So I actually wanted to understand again, what does dyadic sociality index mean? Could you explain it again?
Okay, happy to. We created this index, and if you email me, I can refer you to a paper where we describe it, in which we wanted to combine information about different types of behaviors into a single value. And the practical problem is that some behaviors are much more common than others. So approaches, for example, are more common than grooming, or grunts are more common than grooming. And in order to get those things to contribute equally to the index, we created a really simple algorithm in which each behavior is basically weighted by its overall frequency, and then you can add them up and get a single value. Now, there has been some discussion about whether this is a good thing to do or not. If you research this literature and you follow the references, you'll see people discussing whether or not it's a useful measure or not. The idea was generally to get a measure that allowed us to summarize information about multiple types of affiliative behavior into a single number. And so we found it very useful, but there has been some, whenever you do these things, then you have to realize that the algorithm you use has certain biases or reflects reality in a certain way. But basically, the general idea is to combine information about multiple behaviors into a single value. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. For what it's worth, what you don't want to do is you don't want to have to use, these behaviors are correlated with one another. So if you do analysis of the effects of approaches on paternity, the effect of grooming on paternity, the effect of grunts on paternity, the effects of, time and proximity on paternity. I mean, first of all, you're doing 4 separate tests. So you're inflating your chance of getting a significant result by chance. And you're also generating this really complex analysis where you do 4 analyses that tell you almost exactly the same thing. So we're trying to avoid that. And this is an idea that dates back to a paper that Susan Alberts originally wrote. And then we built on that in work that we did together in Amboseli and then work we did in Marimi. But since that time, there has been a lot of discussion about, is this a good thing to do? did we construct an algorithm in a sensible way? What does it mean?
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We have our next question from Suleima.
Yes, hi. Very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. This is Suleima Tang Martinez. I'm retired from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And a lot of my work pre-retirement was on individual recognition and kin recognition and mechanisms of kin recognition. So the obvious question that I have is whether we know anything about the ability of the males or any of the baboons, but specifically in this case, the males, to recognize their kids by some sort of mechanism, which wouldn't be association, but it could be like self-matching, like let's say there's a family odor that they recognize in the kid or some other, quote unquote, innate type of mechanism, phenotype matching, that sort of thing. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that or if any work has been done.
So we are interested in that. We're interested in the mechanism. A lot of people thought it was entirely improbable that males could recognize their offspring or distinguish their offspring by, basically counting back to the day of ovulation for the female and tracking that. However, I have two observations. One is that there's been a lot of work in primates on phenotypic matching or using phenotypic cues to identify kin based on cues in acoustic cues, based on olfactory cues, based on visual cues. And a lot of this work, and this work hasn't been done on baboons, it's done mostly on macaques and really interesting work on mandrills. And those studies all suggest that there are some mechanisms that the animals can use to distinguish certain types of relatives. So those things are certainly possibly important. I mean, my general guess is that they might use multiple cues, so one thing they might use is their behavior at the time of conception. They might also use phenotypic cues when they're available. What's interesting is that these primary associations seem to emerge during pregnancy when the male doesn't have the infant available for phenotypic cues. So I think the answer is we don't know, but there is evidence for some kind of phenotypic matching or as well as association cues. I mean, my bet is that primates use multiple cues, right? There's no, the question, I guess, would be which cues do they, when the cues are contradictory, which ones do they trust? And I think the answer is we just don't know.
Great. Thanks so much, Joan. And again, thanks for a wonderful talk.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Okay, it's a few of us, and Joan has been very, very kind with her time. She's having several meetings with the organizers of PINE and some of the people that are in our project. So my suggestion would be, I'm gonna, I'll ask Lauren maybe what we could do, unless we have some more questions. If not, maybe we'll finish the live streaming. And those of us who want to hang out a few more minutes before, then we need to give Joan a break. She started very early. Yes, but if I see no further questions, anything, Logan, no questions from our YouTube community today, I guess.
No, not that I've seen.
So with that, my suggestion is that we finish the live streaming. Thanks to those of you who are watching us live on YouTube. Remember that we're going to have a fantastic, somewhat different meeting next Tuesday when we hear from 3 young scholars in Latin America. So we look forward to seeing you then. With that, Lauren, if you want to stop the live streaming.
Thank you all for coming.
I think I made Joan host prematurely. Joan, could you
It's
stop
still
the
live.
So what do you want me to do?
stop the live stream?
I don't seem to have that.
But you
Option.
started it, Lauren.
Yeah, I think when I made Joan host it.
I don't see the option. How do, oh wait, how do I go to